You are now listening to 1-900 Old Ladies, The Lost Art of Making Lefse, written by L. Lee Starr, narrated by the author. Post-production by Pinto Media. Chapter 25. Stanley Peters, Jr. sat next to his mother in the old Himmel cemetery. He was in shock, confounded by her revelation that the man he had called Dad for the last 26 years was not his father at all, but his grandfather. "What do you mean Stanley Peters is not my father? How could that be? Mom, you even named me after him." Stan shook while he screamed at Ellie. "Well, naming you Stan Jr. was really Stanley's idea. He insisted on it," his mother answered. "So, Mom, tell me, who is my father?" he inquired. "Why, Robert, of course." "But wasn't Robert killed in 65 in Vietnam? He probably hadn't been to Himmel since he enlisted in 64, right?" "I was born in April of 66, Stan commented. "Didn't it occur to you that your birthday was a little early?" Ellen asked her son. "Stanley and I were married in November of 65. You were born in April of 66. I think you might have been a tad early to be considered conceived in wedlock," his mother stated. "Okay, but help me out. I don't get how Stanley is not my father, but Robert is." And so, to explain the mystery of Stan Jr.'s paternity, Ellen recounted the story of her rendezvous with her son's true father, Robert Peters. Although Ellie Sievertson and Robert Peters had known each other since they were 18 and 15 respectively, they didn't officially date until 3 years later when Robert turned 18. By that time, Ellen's father, Anders, had passed away, and Sigrid sent Ellie off to Dickinson College for 2 years to become a teacher. Shortly thereafter, Robert's grandfather also passed away, leaving him with a sufficient inheritance to pay for a 4-year college education at North Dakota State University. He went to college and qualified for an educational deferment from the draft until he graduated in the spring of 64. As U.S. activity in the East seemed to be again heightening, Robert, now equipped with a college degree, knew it would be inevitable that troops would eventually be sent to war. He also felt, if he enlisted in the armed forces early enough, he could serve his tour of duty before the war in Vietnam escalated and the United States committed more troops to the war effort. Conscription would most certainly be more aggressively enforced if the U.S. became more involved in East Asia. Robert was by no means a coward, but he fully understood the ramifications of military decisions being made by removed politicians in Washington. He had no interest in dying in vain, but he also had no intention of skirting what he felt was his national duty. And perhaps, if he was permitted to use his education and military training to effect change, he might have felt as though he had made a difference on the battlefield. Ellie was completely against Robert's enlistment from day one. They argued extensively about it. She believed that he should simply wait to see if his number in the lottery ever came up. If it did, he could go. If it didn't, he could stay in Himmel, marry her, and make a life for himself there. After a considerable amount of debate, Robert won out. He enlisted in the Army almost immediately after his graduation. "I'll do this first," he promised Ellie. "Then I'll come back to you, marry you, and we can start a family together. There's no honor in dodging the draft, even if you've dodged it with a little good luck. There will be men dying out there soon, and who am I to say that I am any better than they are?" She realized that it was Robert's tremendous sense of commitment and honor that had attracted her to him in the first place. True, Robert was a very physically attractive man. His brilliant blue eyes seemed to pierce her soul when he spoke to her. The sound of his voice calmed her, and his warm and inviting kisses made her heart flutter. But even after 6 years of steady dating, he never made an inappropriate move on Ellen. Yes, Robert was an honorable man, and that was why Ellie loved him. In July of 64, Robert was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, to serve in the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, as infantryman in the new Air Mobile Division of the Special Forces. It was a very stressful and harrowing time for him. Everything seemed so tentative. The political system was crumbling. President Johnson fumbled to secure his governmental stronghold on communism and steady the reins of democracy. The nature of the draft had changed, and the commitment of troops to Vietnam seemed inevitable. Despite his intense training, Robert still found time to write Ellen letters, which she kept in a box under her bed. His carefully penned letters told of the horrors of war and death and spoke of the political and racial tensions prevalent in the South. He even spoke of meeting his father on several occasions while Stanley still lived in Texas. Robert stated that, after serving in the military, he gained a more insightful understanding of his father, who served in the Army during World War II. In one of his later letters to Ellie, Robert wrote, "You cannot grow up a good man and be a good soldier without losing a little of yourself in the field. It's just not possible to wrong someone in war, friend or foe, if you remind yourself of sins you have committed there. You cannot survive if you do not relinquish the human side of yourself to combat. Even if you return home alive, your conscience, your innocence, and your virtue are most certainly left behind, slain on the battlefield." During the Christmas of 64, Robert was granted a short leave. He traveled from Fort Benning to Bismarck by train. Ellie and Robert's mother picked him up at the station. He stayed at his grandfather's farm for the holidays, but he and Ellen were almost inseparable during that time. Finally, after 6 years of abstinence, Robert and Ellie consummated their relationship. Ellie was a virgin of 27. Robert was 24. As she recalled that very special Christmas, Ellen thought of all the countless stories from her college schoolmates about their sexual prowess. These were young Midwestern girls who were well educated. Many had embraced a coming of age, the sexual revolution. With the advent of oral contraceptives, even the Catholic girls considered sex for recreation. Nobody believed that holding out for one's true love was something that a smart girl needed to do. But Ellie was different. She never seemed to mind if people ridiculed her for upholding traditional values. She embraced the idea of being considered old-fashioned. She loved feeling connected to her past, her home, and her Norwegian family heritage. Most of all, both Ellie and Robert were hopeless romantics. Yes, they were both well educated, articulate, and practical. But they were also hopelessly in love. They clung to the hope that, as soon as Robert could return to Himmel, he had every intention of making Ellen his wife. When he returned to Fort Benning after Christmas leave, Ellie was distraught. Again, they wrote every day without remission. Ellen cherished Robert's letters. He was so articulate and strong. She was so enamored with him. After their last Christmas together, she could say, without a doubt, that he was a passionate and considerate lover. She melted like sand through his fingers when he lovingly caressed her cheek. She swooned at the mere sound of his voice when he called her by name. She lay naked in the loft of the barn as he made passionate love to her. How she yearned to be held in his strong arms. How she desired to catch a glimpse of his nude silhouette against the sunlight once more. All Ellie's hopes crashed to the ground on July 28, when President Johnson announced that he would be deploying Robert's division to Vietnam. "He is surely as good as dead," she thought to herself. "I can't live without Robert. I couldn't possibly survive without him." Robert's next letter to Ellen confirmed that he was being sent to East Asia, but he also added that he had to meet Ellie one last time before being shipped out. School was then out for summer vacation. He could take a train to Minneapolis if she would drive to meet him. There, they could spend a few precious days together before he was deployed to Nam. So Ellie announced to her grandmother that she would be going on a trip for several days. Not to worry, she would return home in time to ready herself for the next school year. Ellen's drive to Minnesota was the first time she had ever left the state. No one in the family even knew that she had taken this trip to Minneapolis. She was, after all, having a clandestine rendezvous with her soldier lover. She was an unmarried teacher in a small town of predominantly Catholic and Lutheran Norwegians and Germans. If word ever got out about Ellie's indiscretions with Robert, however virtuous her ultimate intentions, she would lose both her career and her reputation. After all, it hadn't been long since rural North Dakota teachers were threatened with firing if they even loitered at the ice cream shop or didn't wear at least 2 petticoats. True, the rules of conduct for teachers had relaxed since 1923, but the moral standards for teachers during that time were still quite strict. They met at the Chrome Motel in Minneapolis and pretended to be on their honeymoon. During their 5-day stay during the first week of August, they rarely left their hotel room. They spent every possible moment with each other, lying naked in each other's arms, conversing, and making love. If I could only stop time right here, Ellen thought to herself, I could die right at this moment. I could never love anyone the way I have loved Robert. When Ellie reluctantly returned home to Himmel after her rendezvous with Robert, she had hell to pay with her grandmother. I know that you are out there with Robert, Sigrid perceptibly concluded. I'm not a fool, Ellie. I know, grandmother, but I love him, and there's nothing to say that'll change things now. I've given myself to him, and he's going to marry me when he comes home, Ellie confidently declared. Robert's shift left Charleston, South Carolina on August 14, 1965. It took his unit almost an entire month to reach his base camp in Ankh, a village 42 miles west of Keenon. As Ellie struggled with launching the new school year, dealing with her overwhelming feelings of loneliness, and the realization that she was now 1 month pregnant with Robert's child, she vacillated between feelings of abandonment and hopefulness. Perhaps this will soon be over, and Robert can return to me. We can carry on our lives as husband and wife. After the second full month of Ellie's pregnancy had progressed, it became increasingly harder to hide her state from her grandmother. She finally admitted the truth to Sigrid. What are you going to do now? There's no husband to support you. Ellie considered the possibility of moving away for a short while. This way, she wouldn't have to risk losing her career if she returned. She was faced with a dilemma. She was a single school teacher in a small town, and now she was 2 months pregnant. She needed her $400 a month checks to support her aging grandmother. How could she manage? Ellie finally penned her final letter to Robert during the first week of November 1965. This was the letter informing him that she was indeed pregnant. She needed his help to get her out of this mess. She needed him to do the right thing and marry her now. Her unborn child needed legitimacy, and he needed a father. She could no longer wait for him, as they originally planned. Now was the time. Unfortunately, that was the letter Robert never received. He was killed on November 14th in the Battle of Yatrong Valley. Ellen was 3 months pregnant and visibly showing. She would no longer be able to hide her pregnancy in the sleepy little town of Himmel. She was devastated. The only love of her life had been barbarically attacked and murdered half a world away. He had abandoned her and her unborn child. What's worse, she now desperately needed her job in Himmel. Her grandmother relied on her small paychecks to support them. If news of her pending pregnancy were to slip out now, she would most certainly lose her job and her standing in the Himmel community. As she struggled to make sense of her seemingly directionless life, she sank into an abysmal depression. For the first week, she ate almost nothing and walked through life in a fog. After the army brought Robert's body back and his funeral was held, Ellie had the misfortune to meet Robert's despicable father, Stanley Peters. And that is when Sigrid put her master plan into action. Grandmother's plan was simple. It was a well-known fact that Stanley Peters was an opportunistic drunk. He would attend Robert's memorial service, making every effort to weasel his way into the Himmel community. Most likely, as the mourners met at Robert's mother's farm, Stanley would be left to wallow away his misery at the local tavern. He would have to stay in the small 2-room motel in the center of town. This motel was conveniently close to the tavern. Ellen could meet Stanley at the bar, get Stanley drunk, and seduce him in his motel room. She could later convince Stanley that he had fathered her baby. He would be required to do the only respectable thing he could do, which was to marry her. It was a simple plan, and Ellen carried out her grandmother's plan to the letter. She did meet him at the local bar while he sobbed over his 6th glass of bourbon. And she also escorted him, half conscious, to his hotel room. But what Ellie did not count on was the fact that Stanley's war injury had rendered him completely impotent. He could no longer perform sexually. She was, in fact, pleasantly surprised that Stanley could not perform at all in the bedroom. She was prepared to seduce him despite the fact that she found him repulsive. As a result, she did what any young and desperate pregnant young female in her position would do. She waited for Stanley to pass out on the bed and stripped him of all his clothing. Then she stripped down to her naked body and slept next to him in the bed. When he awoke, hungover, and devoid of any memory of the previous evening, she deceived him into believing that he had made passionate and unforgettable love to her. 2 weeks later, she convinced him that he had impregnated her, and he quickly married her. Those events preceded Ellen and Stanley's 27-year marriage, made in hell. Now, of course, Ellie knew the entire truth. She was originally riddled with the guilt over the thought that she had deceived Stanley into thinking that Stan Jr. was his son. In reality, he had read her letter to Robert even before they wed. He knew full well that Ellie had tried to pull the wool over his eyes and over the eyes of the citizens of Himmel. But he played along with her charade. He was certain that his first wife had spread word of his impotency to all her trusted friends and family. Boasting that he had sired Ellen's son, his grandson, made him appear potent and virile. And despite Stanley's repeated denials that he ever cared what the people of Himmel thought of him, he, at the very least, wanted them to perceive him as masculine. "I'm sorry, son. I wanted to tell you the truth sooner. I suppose, as time wore on and Grandmother Sigrid passed away, I worried more about what people might have thought about your reputation than mine. Most of the time, it just seemed easier to stay with Stan, even after your great-grandmother tried to convince me to kick him out. You probably know this now that you have a little one, but you try to do right by your kids. You try to set a good example for them. Truth is, they grow up however they're going to grow up. You really haven't got much to do with how they come out. They are who they are. You just keep them fed and clothed and make them brush their teeth once in a while. Other than that, you can only hope that they come back to you and don't hate you for making them do that stuff." Stan sat completely silent as he listened to his mother recount the story of his conception and the true identity of his father. After hearing Ellen's confession and her newly modified philosophy on child rearing, all his pent-up anger over the events of the previous few weeks seemed to dissipate. Ellie continued, "I hope you don't hate me for this, son. You know I love you. I want you to be happy." "No, Mom," Stan assured her. "I don't hate you. I could never hate you." He paused thoughtfully. "Deep down, I had always hoped that Stanley wasn't my real father. I think I secretly hoped that Robert, or someone like him, was my real father. I think that's why I named my own son after him. He continued, I'm kind of glad that Stanley is only my grandfather. Maybe that means the bad genes have been diluted out 2 generations. He chuckled as he presented his theory to Ellen. Ellie chuckled also. Maybe so, son. On the bright side, now that Stanley's dead, you could change your name to whatever else you want. Whatever you decide is okie dokie by me. She smiled again and patted her son on the cheek. Oh, and son? Yes, Mom. I want you to come live with me here in North Dakota with Rosa and my 2 grandbabies, Ellie smiled. Grandbabies? Stan asked pointedly. Ellen cringed after she suddenly realized she had revealed Rosa's latest secret. Oops, I think I let the cat out of the bag. Rosa's going to kill me.